Hello and welcome to Torah Thoughts. This week's Torah portion, the Parsha of the week, is Parshat Mikeitz, which literally translates to the end. The Torah here is talking about the end of a 2-year period. Backing up, to get a little bit of context, we remember from last week's Parsha we read how Joseph's brothers sold him as a slave. He wound up as a slave in Egypt, and then he ended up in prison. While in prison, Joseph encountered 2 of Pharaoh's ministers who had themselves been imprisoned, and they each tell him about a dream that they had, and Joseph goes ahead and interprets the dream correctly. One of them, the interpretation of the dream, was that he would be executed for the crime that put him in prison, and the other one, the interpretation was that he would be found not guilty, and he'd be restored to his position as the minister of Pharaoh's winery. So now, as he gets out of prison, Joseph says to him, "Remember, I helped you. Put in a good word for me with Pharaoh." And the Torah tells us the head of the winery got back to his position and completely forgot about Joseph. And now, that story having taken place, life goes on, and it's the end of a 2-year period. What happens at the end of the 2-year period, after the head of the winery gets released from prison? The story about Pharaoh's famous dream takes place. What's this famous dream? Pharaoh dreams that he sees 7 cows coming out of the Nile River. 7 fat, healthy, beautiful cows. And they're pasturing right there, eating grass on the river. And at the same, right after that, after them comes 7 scrawny, skinny-looking cows who looks like they haven't eaten in years. And the 7 scrawny cows swallow up the 7 fat cows, but they remain just as skinny, just as scrawny as if nothing ever happened. And he wakes up. And then he fell asleep again and had a second dream. And this time he dreams that there's a stalk of corn, and on this stalk of corn there's 7 ears of corn, fat, big, healthy ears of corn. And then there's 7 skinny ears of corn that look like the wind had they were withered from the wind. And the 7 skinny, scrawny ears of corn swallow up the 7 big, fat, healthy ears of corn. And Pharaoh wakes up. And he's disturbed by this dream. And Pharaoh went ahead and he called all of his ministers and all of his advisors, and he wants to know what is the meaning of this dream. What's the interpretation? And none of his advisors were able to satisfactorily interpret Pharaoh's dream. And the Torah says, "Ve'ein poter otam leparo." There wasn't anyone who was able to interpret them to Paro. And Rashi explains, Ve'ein poter otam leparo. It could have simply said Ve'ein poter otam. None of them were able to interpret it. Obviously, we know we're talking about Paro here. That's the context of the story. And Rashi explains what it means is, none of them were able to interpret it in such a way that it gave meaning to the fact that he is Paro, that he's the Pharaoh of Egypt. Paro would not accept an interpretation that didn't give significance to his greatness. So they said, you're going to have 7 daughters and you're going to bury 7 daughters. What's that got to do with me being Paro? You're going to build 7 cities and you're going to lose 7 cities. What's that got to do with how great I am? Ultimately, the head of Pharaoh's winery does step up. He tells Paro about the story with Joseph. When I was in prison, he correctly interpreted my dream. Paro immediately sends for Joseph, and Joseph correctly interprets Paro's dream. What does he say? He says, this dream, it's God telling you what he's about to do. He says, Et asher ha'elokim oseh higid leParo. What God intends to do, he's telling Paro. And then he goes on and tells him that the 7 fat cows and the 7 healthy ears of corn represent 7 healthy years of good crops. And then the 7 scrawny ears of corn and the 7 scrawny cows represent 7 years of famine. And Joseph is telling Paro, God is giving you a heads up. And he's telling you that there's going to be 7 good years and 7 bad years, and you must prepare. Here's what you're going to do. Now Joseph steps out of bounds here. Paro didn't ask him, what do we do about the crisis that has just been foretold? He wanted to know the meaning of the dream. But Joseph steps out of bounds and he tells Paro, well, I just told you the problem. Now here's the answer. During the 7 good years, you got to gather up a lot of food. You got to store it. You have to acquire as much storage of food as you can. And then during the 7 years of famine, you'll be able to distribute all this food. You can ration it out and even sell it. And Paro loves the idea. In fact, he places Joseph in charge of all of this. Why does Paro love the idea? And how did Joseph know Paro was going to love the idea? For the same reason he rejected the other interpretations. Because now Joseph is telling Paro, it is you, O great and mighty Pharaoh. Look how important you are. God is telling you what he plans to do. He's giving you a heads up. The entire world is going to go through this whole situation. But you, O great and mighty Pharaoh, God is speaking to you. He's conferring with you about his plans. And not only that, but the reason why God is doing that is to make you the savior, O great Pharaoh. You will be the one to feed the world during this great famine. And Paro loves it. Now, of course, it turns out that the interpretation was true. We see if we read further in the Torah, that the 7 years of famine did take place. And the 7 good years, then the 7 years of famine. And as the story continues, Paro appoints Yosef as the head of all of Egypt. He's second only to Pharaoh, and Paro makes it clear, only in the sense of my title, I am Pharaoh. But otherwise, Joseph is the ruler of Egypt. And the famine does eventually hit, and everyone in the area comes to Egypt when they find out that there's food in Egypt. And sure enough, who comes? Joseph's brothers. Yaakov sends his 10 sons. Joseph had 11 brothers, right? There was 12 of them. But the youngest son, Benjamin, stays home, and the older 10 sons, Yaakov sends them to Egypt, go get some food. And Joseph is expecting this. He knows the entire world is coming looking for food, and he's expecting his brothers to show up. And what does it say? When his brothers show up, Joseph has them, he has them taken into custody and brought before him. And the Torah tells us that Joseph's brothers didn't recognize who he was, but he recognized them. Now, granted, Joseph was much older at the time, but so were they. And they came to Egypt with the idea, you know what, while we're there, let's look for Joseph. Maybe we can find him. So here they are looking for their brothers, and even after 22 years, there's a resemblance. From a person being 17 to a person being 39, I know from experience. When I was a kid, I was 12 years old. Years later, I'm in my 40s. Someone who was in my class when we were 12 approaches me and asks me if I recognize him. And he simply recognized my face. Now, when someone's looking for their brother, you're searching for him. You know where you're going to recognize some sort of complexion, especially when you come face to face with him and there's a confrontation, there's an interaction. So how was it that they didn't recognize him? Well, the Torah gives it to us right here. It says, Vayar Yosef et Echav. I'm sorry, go back one verse. In verse, chapter 42, verse 6. And Yosef, Yosef, hu hashalit al haaretz. And Yosef was the one who was in charge of the land. Hu hamashbir l'chol ha'am haaretz. He's the one who rationed out the food to all of the people of the land. Vayavau achei Yosef, and Yosef's brothers came. Vayishtachavu lo apayim arza, and they bowed to him with their face to the ground. What's that got to do with them recognizing him? Hold on. So Yosef is king. The brothers show up. They bow down to him. Vayar Yosef et Echav. And Yosef saw his brothers. Vayakirim. And he recognized them. Vayitnaker aleim. And he acted like a stranger to them. Vayidaber itam kashot. And he spoke harshly to them. Vayomer aleim. And he said to them, Ma'ayin ba'atem. Where are you coming from? Vayamru, Meretz Canaan. Lishbor. We come from Canaan to buy food. So Yosef here is playing dumb. Okay, here he is, the great master. He had the title Tzofnat Paneach, so obviously they didn't call him by the name Yosef. And he sees them, and he's acting like this big authority, and he's coming down on them. And then it says, Vayaker Yosef et Echav, Hem lo hikiru. And Yosef recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. What's going on here? Yosef's brothers, the Torah is telling us the reason first, and then, nope, they didn't recognize him. They came looking for Yosef, and the last time they had seen him, he was a slave. They had beaten him up, they'd thrown him into a pit, he was on his knees, he was crying and begging, and they sold him as a slave. That's whom they're expecting to find when they come looking for their brother. Not someone who is the ruler of Egypt, and not just the ruler of Egypt. He's harsh. He's coming down on them. He's accusing them of spying. That's not the guy they're looking for. So even if they're looking at his face, all 10 of them, And they have this lengthy confrontation with him. We see later on Joseph imprisoned them for 3 days. And he comes back and forth and he negotiates with them. And then he sends them home. All this time, they're looking for Yosef, staring him in the face. And they don't see it's him because it's not the man they expect. Going back to the same situation with Paro in the dream. Paro was so full of himself that he expected everything to be about him. Now, it was in fact about him, but no, it's got to be about his greatness. If it's not about my greatness, then the dream's interpretation can't be correct. And the same thing here. If he's not whom we expect, then that can't be him. And that's human nature. People tend to see what they expect to see. People tend to believe the narrative that they want to believe. You'll never see two people who have a car accident, for example, and one guy says, I passed the stop sign, and the other says, no, I passed the stop sign, you had the right of way. That never happens. Everyone believes according to what benefits them. You'll never see two people go to court saying, Judge, this man lent me money. I owe him money. And the other guy yells, no, he paid me back. That doesn't happen. Everyone argues politics. Everyone will argue a political position that benefits them. Everyone believes their narrative. They believe what they expect, what they hope to find. And that's why Paro didn't believe the other interpretations, which in this particular case turned out to be correct. And that's why he believed Yosef. Everyone has their own biases. But then we notice something interesting. Here's what happens. So Yosef comes down on his brothers, and he's testing them. Okay, he wants to see whether they really regret that they sold him into slavery. Now again, think of Yosef's perspective here, okay? He's a 17-year-old kid sold into slavery. We might read this like from one week to the next. Last week Yosef was sold as a slave. This week he's the second in command in all of Egypt. But no, it's a difficult, what he went through, 22 years. He grew up practically becoming from a boy to a man, having been put through hell. He went through, it's a new life. He's not the same person he was 22 years ago. And now, and he named his children Ephraim and Manasseh, which basically it's named in such a way as to imply that he had forgotten the troubles of his youth, the troubles of his home, and essentially Yosef, he's moved on with his life, it seems, and suddenly the whole issue with his brothers awakens. His brothers show up and he's like, oh, them. And we see that he's just got to know. He's got to get to the bottom of what happened when I left. Did they regret it? And so he comes down on them. He's testing them. And they say, oh, no, we're the sons of Yaakov who lives in Canaan. And the reason we're searching through when we came into Egypt is not because we're spying. It's because we have a brother that he went missing. And we're hoping that we can find him. And Yosef was wondering, are they saying this as an excuse because they're in trouble here with the ruler of Egypt? Or are they sincere? Is that really what's going on? Are they searching for him? And they also said, we have another brother at home. And Yosef obviously knows, we're talking about Benjamin. And he sends them home. You know what? I'll believe your story if that detail turns out to be true. First he arrests all of them, and then 3 days later he says, okay, you know what? One of you stay here, the rest of you, the 9 of you, go back. Bring me that younger brother, and then I'll believe your entire story. And he keeps Shimon. Incidentally, the two brothers, Shimon and Levi, they were the ones who conspired against him. They were the ones behind the whole thing, the whole thing against Yosef, selling him as a slave, everything. And he knows that Shimon and Levi, they're also the ones who destroyed the city of Shechem. The two of them as a team, they're dangerous. So he separates them, and he keeps Shimon in custody. He sends the rest of them back, and it takes a while for them to convince Yaakov, but ultimately, well, they're starving. Yaakov agrees to send Binyamin, and when Yosef sees Binyamin, he gets a little softer. He continues testing them, and this parsha ends when the saga is still not over. It's like a to be continued kind of thing. At the end of the parsha, what we have is Yosef gives all of them food. He gives them sacks full of food, but he frames Binyamin for stealing his magic goblet. It wasn't a magic goblet, but he was pretending that it was. And now he pretends that he's going to hold Binyamin hostage. He's going to hold him prisoner for stealing this goblet, and he wants to see whether his brothers are going to stand up for Binyamin. Now, as this whole story is progressing, we notice that Yosef, he's coming down on them, but there are two occasions in the story where Yosef breaks down and cries. One is when Yosef is speaking to them in Egyptian and they're speaking in Hebrew. And there's an interpreter in between, so they don't know that Yosef understands Hebrew. And so they said among themselves, when Yosef says, "That's it, I'm keeping one of you here, and you guys go back, and until you bring me your younger brother, he's my hostage." And they say to each other, "It's because we did this terrible thing to our brother Yosef that this is happening to us. God is punishing us. Why did we do this? We should have been nicer to him." And Yosef hears this, and he gets emotional. And he breaks down. He has to leave the room. And he breaks down and cries. And then he he regains his composure and he comes back. And the second time that Yosef breaks down in this parsha crying is when he meets Binyamin. And Rashi explains, he talks to Binyamin. Again, he's still playing this role like he doesn't know him. And he says to him, "So do you have, you're all brothers, but from the same mother?" And Binyamin says, "No, we have different mothers." And, again, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, and Zvulun, they have one mother, Leah. And Dan and Naphtali have a mother, Bilhah. And Gad and Asher have one mother, Zilpah. And Binyamin, Yosef says to him, "Do you have any brothers from the same mother?" He says, "Yes, but he was lost." Binyamin was 10 years old when Yosef was sold as a slave. And here it's 22 years later, which makes him 32. And again, Binyamin grew up without Yosef, without his older brother. And he says to him, I don't know what happened to him. He disappeared. I never heard from him again. And Yosef says to him, okay, he moves on to like a different topic. He says, "Do you have any children?" And Binyamin says, "Yes, I have children." And he asks them for their names. And Binyamin tells him their names, and each one of their names had to do with his longing for his brother Yosef. And when Yosef hears this, he gets emotional. Binyamin grew up without him. But to Yosef's surprise, he didn't forget him. Every day he longed for him, even into adulthood, to the point that he named his children. People name their children after happy occasions. People name their children after people they admire. After stuff that they hope for. Binyamin named his children after his longing for his brother Yosef. And Yosef gets very emotional about that. And he has to leave the room. And he has to, again, he cries. And he has to straighten himself out, regain his composure, washes his face, and then comes back out to continue the story. So what's going on here is Yosef was caught by surprise. Again, with all this, the narrative, you see things in your own narrative. Suddenly Yosef saw something that wasn't in the narrative that he expected. He expects to see his brothers having moved. These are the cruel brothers that were cruel to him. They sold him as a slave. Can you imagine selling your brother as a slave? And Yosef sees something he doesn't expect. He sees regret. He sees that all of this, there's another dynamic to it that he hasn't been exposed to for the past 22 years. They sincerely regret it. And his little brother, who was innocent in all of this, never forgot him. Yosef, in this case, sees the story from a narrative that he didn't expect. And I think here lies the lesson in this parsha. Yaakov's family, we see with his brothers, with his two wives who were sisters, and then the other two wives who were their men. Yaakov's family is a dysfunctional family. And we Jews are also a dysfunctional family. And there's an old expression, it's cliche, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and people laugh at that because it's an understatement. What happens is we always look at things in our own narrative, from the angle that we want to see it, with our own biases. But what happens when you see something completely different than you expected? Throw away your biases, throw away your expectations, and look for things in the way they really are. And when that surprise hits you, that's when you come closer with your brothers. That's when you become a family. And that's when healing begins. That's my Torah thought for the week. What's yours? Post it in a comment. Post it as your own post. And if you like the Torah thought, hit like. Feel free to share it. Thank you for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.